She walked into the prison thinking she could make a difference. Melissa Higgins wasn't just the warden's wife. She was a volunteer, a woman of faith, someone who believed that even the worst men deserved a second chance. She taught reading and writing to inmates twice a week, never missing a class. But one inmate was different. Derek Malone was charming, articulate, handsome, and dangerously persuasive. Their secret affair started with passing glances, then whispers, and then stolen moments behind locked doors. What Melissa didn't know was that Derek had been living with HIV for years, and by the time she found out, it was too late. She confessed everything to her husband, Robert Higgins, the man who ran the prison like a fortress, a man who believed in control, in order, and above all, in obedience. 2 weeks later, Melissa was dead, and the man who was supposed to protect her became the prime suspect. Nestled deep in the pine-blanketed hills of northern Georgia sat the Jackson Ridge Correctional Facility, a mid-level state prison surrounded by high concrete walls, razor wire, and silence. For over 2 decades, it had operated like clockwork, strict, structured, and mostly invisible to the world beyond. At the heart of it all was Warden Robert Higgins, a man both respected and feared. In his late 40s, Robert wasn't loud, but his presence filled a room like smoke, creeping, heavy, inescapable. He spoke with clipped authority, walked with military posture, and demanded complete order from both his staff and inmates. He believed in rules, discipline, control, and that extended far beyond the prison walls, all the way into his home. His wife, Melissa, had once been a lively woman. Born and raised in a quiet suburb outside Savannah, she had studied English literature, sang in the church choir, and volunteered at soup kitchens. Before she was Mrs. Higgins, Melissa Foster had dreams that reached beyond the steeple of her small-town church. She used to write short stories in the margins of her textbooks, tales of women who ran toward freedom, not away from it. Her college professors told her she had a gift, that her words made people feel seen. She wanted to teach, maybe write a novel one day. She imagined a life filled with laughter, filled with music and messy love, and Sunday mornings that smelled like cinnamon rolls. Not cold floors and silence. Not walking on eggshells in her own kitchen. Then she met Robert at a charity event for veterans. He was polished, poised, and carried himself like a man who always knew the rules. She thought his strength would protect her. She didn't realize it would one day become a cage. When she married Robert at 26, she thought she was signing up for a life of stability and purpose. Instead, she found herself shrinking. Robert wasn't violent, but he didn't need to be. He monitored her schedule, corrected her language, and gently, over the years, replaced her instincts with silence. By the time she was 35, Melissa had lost most of her friends, stopped singing, and rarely smiled. Her one outlet, the only thing she insisted on keeping, was her volunteer work inside the prison. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, she entered Jackson Ridge not as the warden's wife, but as Miss Melissa, the reading instructor. It was in Classroom B, tucked between the library and the infirmary, that she met Derek Malone. Derek wasn't like the other inmates. He was 29, tall and lean, with sharp cheekbones and an easy southern drawl. His rap sheet was long: fraud, assault, grand theft, but he carried himself like a college grad. He quoted Baldwin. He dissected novels. He asked Melissa questions no one else did. Why do you think the author used fire as a metaphor here, Miss Melissa? No inmate had ever asked her that before. Most of them barely read aloud. But Derek? He read with intention, with rhythm, with something that felt dangerously close to charm. At first, Melissa was flattered, then curious, then something worse, attached. She told herself it was just interest in his growth, that he reminded her of a younger student she once taught, that she was proud of his improvement. But then came the second glances, the inside jokes, the lingering hands when passing out worksheets. One afternoon, as he stayed behind to help her shelve books, he said softly, "You're not like him, you know. You see people. You feel things." Melissa's stomach fluttered. Her fingers trembled, and something inside her cracked open. Back in the warden's office, Robert Higgins began to notice changes. Melissa was dressing differently. She seemed distant, distracted. But instead of confronting her, he doubled down on surveillance. He had cameras, logs, guards. Nothing got past him, except love, or maybe obsession. He would later tell detectives he suspected something, but couldn't believe his wife would betray him, especially not with a convicted felon. But the truth was, Melissa had grown lonely in that cold brick house at the edge of the compound. She hadn't been touched in months. She hadn't been seen in years. And Derek? He saw her. He spoke to her like she mattered, like she still had music in her, like she was something more than just the warden's wife. What no one knew, what Melissa herself didn't know, was that Derek Malone had a secret far more dangerous than his record. He was HIV positive. He'd been diagnosed 5 years earlier, back when he was first incarcerated. The prison doctor knew. The system knew. But Melissa, she never even thought to ask. Why would she? Derek was careful, calculated. He made her feel safe. And that illusion would soon cost her everything. By mid-September, the affair had fully crossed the line. Secret notes tucked into books. Quick touches in staff-only corridors. A rendezvous in the storage closet just off the kitchen. It wasn't just flirtation anymore. It was a fire, and it was spreading quietly, quickly, into every part of their lives. Melissa had no idea she'd already contracted the virus. Robert had no idea he was sleeping in a house full of lies. And Derek? He just kept turning pages in their little book club, already knowing how this story would end. And when it did, it would be in blood. It started with books. Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, James Baldwin. Melissa brought them in week after week, stacked in her tote bag beside pencils and lesson plans. Derek always reached for them first. He handled the pages like they were sacred, asked questions that cut deeper than comprehension. He wasn't just reading, he was listening. And in between those lines, he was speaking to her. "This part right here," he said once, tapping a worn copy of The Bluest Eye. "It's about loneliness, ain't it? Feeling invisible even when people look right at you." Melissa froze. For a second, she forgot they were in a classroom surrounded by chain-link windows and buzzed-in doors. She forgot the cameras. She forgot her last name. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what it's about." From then on, the space between them got smaller. He sat closer. She lingered longer. By early October, they had a rhythm. When class ended, Derek would stay behind to help her clean up. He was always careful, never too close, never too long. Just long enough to leave her wanting. One morning, she found a folded slip of paper tucked between pages of Native Son. It wasn't a love note, not exactly. Just one line. "If you ever want to feel seen, you know where to find me." It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. Melissa told herself she wouldn't respond. That this was a fantasy, a lonely woman's illusion. But the lie unraveled quickly. That Thursday, she stayed after class, pretended to organize the shelves while the guards filed the others out. Derek stood in the far corner, arms crossed, waiting. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "Neither should you," he said, his voice calm. "But you keep coming back." She looked up at him. His eyes weren't hungry or mocking. They were still, serious, and something in her gave way. She closed the distance between them. It was barely a touch, the back of her fingers against his wrist, but it set fire to the room. For a few seconds, nothing existed but the silence between two people who had forgotten who they were supposed to be. They didn't kiss. Not yet, but they both knew they would. The following weeks were filled with secrecy. Codes written into lesson plans. Books passed back and forth with words circled that meant something else entirely. A scribbled underline under the word want became a proposition. A dot beside the word alone meant tonight. Melissa began to sneak into the unused supply room behind the kitchen, where Derek worked under the prison's vocational training program. They had 10 minutes, sometimes 15. The room smelled like oil and old paper towels. It was dark, hot, hidden, and it became the center of her world. She knew it was reckless, knew the risks. But in Derek's arms, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Alive. Back home, Robert noticed her glow. At first, he mistook it for gratitude, assumed the volunteer work was finally giving her a sense of purpose again. But then he started noticing other things. She was checking her appearance more carefully, brushing her hair before bed, listening to music again, wearing perfume. He asked her once, just once, if something was going on. Melissa smiled politely and said no. Robert didn't press. He never did. But the question stayed with him like a splinter. Inside the prison, Derek was a master of discretion. He never bragged, never made her promises. He never even used the word love. But he knew her in a way that no one else did. He listened when she spoke about her mother's death, held her when she cried about not having children. He made her feel like the woman she used to be, before she became someone's wife, someone's shadow. What he didn't tell her was this. He had been diagnosed with HIV 5 years ago, during a routine intake screening. It was in his file. He'd signed a waiver, got his medication monthly, took it inconsistently, and kept it quiet. He told himself it wasn't her business. He told himself she wouldn't understand. And maybe, deep down, he didn't want to risk losing her. Then came the night she didn't show. He waited in the storage room. 5 minutes. 10. 15. When she finally arrived, her face was pale, her lips tight. I went to the clinic, she said. Something's wrong. Derek froze. What do you mean? They said I need more tests. They think it might be HIV. She said it like it was a ghost. Something that lived outside her body. Something that hadn't fully become real yet. Derek didn't speak. Didn't confess. Just stared at the wall behind her. You knew, didn't you? She asked, voice cracking. Still nothing. Jesus, Derek. And then she left, slamming the door so hard the mop buckets rattled. 3 days passed. Then Melissa knocked on her husband's office door. We need to talk, she said. That conversation would unravel everything. The affair, the diagnosis, the betrayal. And within 2 weeks, she would be found dead beneath a bridge, and Robert Higgins will be the last person seen with her alive. Melissa sat in the passenger seat of her car, parked outside the women's health clinic, hands frozen on the steering wheel. The paper in her lap crinkled with each shallow breath she took. Preliminary positive for HIV antibodies. Further testing recommended. She couldn't stop staring at that one word, positive. The nurse had tried to explain calmly that it didn't mean it was certain yet, that false positives could happen, that a follow-up test would confirm everything. But Melissa hadn't heard a word after the phrase, "You should sit down." She had only been with one man in over a year. One man who hadn't used protection. One man who knew better and said nothing. Derek. Melissa blinked hard and turned the key. The car started, but she didn't drive. Her hands trembled too much. At home, Robert was in his usual position, behind his desk in the den, reading reports, sipping cold coffee, the television muted on the news channel. He looked up when she came in, noting the way her face had drained of color. You all right? Melissa didn't answer. She walked past him, into the kitchen, opened the faucet, and let the water run, as if the noise might drown out the war inside her head. That night, she didn't sleep. Her mind spun in loops. Shame, guilt, anger, terror. How had she been so careless? So trusting? She wasn't a teenager. She was the warden's wife, the volunteer, the good one. The next morning, she called in sick to the prison. Then she called the clinic to schedule a follow-up. And then, with shaking fingers, she called Derek's housing unit and left a message with the supervisor. That afternoon, they met in the laundry storeroom. Her face was pale, her voice flat. I tested positive. Derek looked down, jaw tightening. He didn't act surprised. Didn't even pretend. I told you I wasn't clean, he muttered. You never said HIV. I said I was dangerous. You didn't want details. I was in love with you, Derek. I trusted you. You think I don't feel guilty? You think I wanted this? The room thickened with tension. Melissa took a step back, her voice trembling. I'm not just your volunteer. I'm someone's wife. I have a life. I have a name. You think I don't know that? He snapped, suddenly angry. You think I forget every damn time I see that ring on your finger? I'm going to tell him, she whispered. I can't keep lying. Derek stared at her, eyes cold now. Then do it. But don't pretend this was just my fault. That night, Melissa sat in silence at the kitchen table, staring at her reflection in a half-empty glass of wine. Robert was still in his office. The same muted news channel, the same cold coffee, the same man who hadn't touched her in months, but still controlled the oxygen in the room. She stood up slowly and walked in. Can we talk? She said. Robert looked up, confused by her tone. Is something wrong? Yes, she said quietly. Something's very wrong. She sat across from him. Her hands were cold, her throat dry, but she spoke deliberately, clearly, no longer hiding. She told him everything. The classes, the books, the affair, the pregnancy scare she hadn't mentioned, the diagnosis, and finally, the truth that shattered him. I tested positive. For HIV, the room went still. No reaction, no shouting, no cursing. Robert just blinked. Once, twice, and then he stood up and walked to the bar cart by the wall, poured 2 fingers of bourbon, swirled it, sipped. How long? He asked, voice flat. About 4 months. And it was just him? Yes. He nodded slowly, set the glass down, walked past her, didn't say another word. Melissa didn't sleep that night either. But this time, she wasn't the only one lying awake in the dark. Over the next 2 days, Robert didn't speak of it. He didn't mention her confession, didn't ask questions, didn't raise his voice. But Melissa felt the shift. The air in the house grew heavier. He didn't kiss her goodbye in the morning, didn't touch his food. He left the lights on in the hallway all night, as if he didn't want to give the shadows a place to hide. Melissa tried to pretend life was moving forward. She baked. She folded laundry. She called the clinic again. But Robert was changing. He had been a man of rules, of structure. And now, the one person closest to him had broken the most sacred one, loyalty. That Friday, Melissa packed a small overnight bag. She told him she'd be staying at her sister's house for a few days. He didn't respond. She walked out the door, paused at the bottom of the porch, and looked back just once. Robert was standing in the upstairs window, still as a statue, watching her drive away. What she didn't know was that he would follow her, that he would track her phone, that he would see the clinic address in her GPS history, and that by the time she returned 3 days later, Robert had already decided what kind of punishment fit her crime. The sound of shouting echoed off the concrete walls like thunder. It was 2:47 p.m. on a humid Tuesday when a fight broke out in the vocational workshop at Jackson Ridge Correctional. The security feed later showed 3 inmates swarming Derek Malone, cornering him between 2 metal lockers near the back wall. By the time the guards got to him, Derek was on the floor, curled into a fetal position, bleeding heavily from his side. A shiv, crude, jagged, made from a sharpened toothbrush handle, was later recovered beneath a mop sink nearby. The official report called it a targeted assault, but no one could say why. Derek was rushed to the infirmary, his prison jumpsuit soaked with blood. He was lucky. The blade had missed his organs by an inch. Still, he lost a lot of blood and needed stitches, antibiotics, and 2 weeks of close monitoring. When questioned, he said little. "They just came at me," he muttered. Said, "I was a snitch." He refused to name names. But something in his eyes betrayed more. Not fear, not confusion, but knowing. As if he'd expected it. As if it was inevitable. When the incident report landed on Detective Laura Monroe's desk, it looked like just another case of prison violence. But Laura was the kind of investigator who didn't skim. She read every line, and something didn't sit right. 3 inmates attacking a 4th, with no warning, no prior tension, and no gang ties. That didn't track. Laura had been with the Georgia Department of Corrections for 8 years. She was known for her quiet intensity, a woman who listened more than she spoke and always asked the right question. She visited the prison 2 days later. The moment she stepped through the gates of Jackson Ridge, she felt it, a tension in the air that went beyond routine lockdown. The guards avoided eye contact. The warden was unavailable. And the staff? Tight-lipped. Laura met with the assistant warden, a middle-aged man named Quinn, who looked exhausted before she even opened her notepad. "You're looking into the Malone stabbing?" he asked, rubbing his temples. "Among other things," Laura replied. She asked for footage, access logs, inmate histories, and most importantly, the warden's visitor records. Quinn froze for a split second, just long enough for Laura to notice. "Is there something I should know?" she asked. "You'll find what you need," he said quickly. "It's all there." In the infirmary, Derek lay on his side, half awake, his Ford drip humming beside him. His face was gaunt, but his eyes lit up when Laura entered. "You the one they sent to clean this up?" he asked with a faint smirk. "Something like that," Laura said, pulling a chair beside his bed. "You want to tell me what really happened?" "Already did," he replied. "I don't believe you." Derek studied her for a moment, then looked away. "Sometimes," he said softly, "you play with fire, and you get burned." Who lit the match? He didn't answer. Was it the warden? That got his attention. His head turned sharply, his expression a mix of fear and defiance. "I'm not saying anything more." Laura knew that look, the kind of silence born not from guilt but from fear. She stood. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "if someone wants you dead, they'll try again. You won't get a third chance." That night, she reviewed the footage from the vocational workshop. The camera had gone offline for exactly 6 minutes before the attack. As scheduled maintenance, entry was filed in the system, but curiously, no technician had signed off on it. More curious still, Laura found a deleted log buried in the prison's digital maintenance database, showing that Warden Robert Higgins had accessed the security system that same morning. She leaned back in her chair. "What were you doing, Warden?" The next morning, Laura returned to the prison with a request to interview staff. She was met at the gate by Warden Higgins himself. He was calm, crisp uniform, hands behind his back. "Detective Monroe," he said, "I hear you've taken an interest in my facility." "Just doing my job, sir." "You won't find anything here. Just another day behind bars." His tone was polite, his smile practiced, but Laura saw the slight twitch in his jaw when she mentioned Derek's name, the way his fingers tapped once against his belt. She filed it away. Later that day, she spoke to a kitchen worker who nervously mentioned seeing Melissa in the workshop hallway several times after hours, when she wasn't scheduled to be on site. "You sure it was her?" Laura asked. "Yes, ma'am. She always wore that pink cardigan. And perfume. Like real perfume, you know?" Laura's mind clicked. Melissa Higgins had been here. With Derek. After hours. And now Derek was bleeding in the infirmary, and Melissa? Nowhere to be seen. She checked the visitor logs. Melissa hadn't checked in for the last week. That evening, Laura called the clinic listed in Melissa's file. They confirmed her last appointment, 3 days ago, and that she had requested her records be mailed to a different address. Not her home, a P.O. box. Detective Monroe stared at the printout in her hand, her gut tightening. What the hell were you planning, Melissa? Hannah hadn't heard from her sister in 5 days. At first, she told herself it was nothing. Maybe Melissa just needed space. But the silence felt wrong. It had weight, like something thick and invisible pressing on her chest every time she checked her phone. By the second day, Hannah was calling every hospital in the area. By the third, she was driving out to Jackson Ridge herself, sitting in the parking lot, staring at the tall gray walls like they might offer answers. She left voicemails, emailed her old college friends, posted a missing person flyer in a Facebook group full of local church members. She even drove by the tiny diner where she and Melissa used to meet for breakfast once a month, just in case. What haunted her most was the last time they saw each other. They had met for tea. Melissa barely touched her drink. She had held Hannah's hand across the table, her grip trembling, and whispered, "I don't know who I am anymore." Hannah didn't know what to say then. She thought it was just stress, a rough patch. Now, she prayed it wasn't goodbye. The call came in at 6:12 a.m. on a cold Friday morning. A jogger had spotted something near the edge of Lake Hartwell, about 40 miles from Jackson Ridge Prison. At first, he thought it was a mannequin, pale, twisted, half buried in the brush beside the water. It wasn't. The body of a woman lay partially submerged near a rocky embankment, her skin bloated, hair tangled with debris. A pink cardigan clung to her shoulders like a flag of lost innocence. Detectives arrived within the hour. ID found in her purse confirmed what they feared. Melissa Higgins, age 36, Warden's wife, missing for 5 days. The initial signs pointed to suicide. There were no visible bruises, no defensive wounds. Her car was found parked neatly in a nearby lot, keys still inside. No note, but a folded pamphlet from the HIV clinic was tucked in the passenger seat. Damp from condensation, but still legible. For a moment, it all made sense. A woman drowning in shame. Diagnosed with a disease. Affair exposed. Marriage collapsing. Except something didn't fit. Her fingernails. They were broken, jagged, like she had tried to grab something. Or someone. And her shoes, neatly placed beside the car, didn't match the pattern of the abrasions on her feet. She hadn't walked barefoot to that lake. She'd been dragged. Detective Laura Monroe arrived at the scene just before the coroner zipped the body bag. The moment she saw the victim's face, Laura's stomach sank. She had hoped, irrationally, that Melissa was hiding, that she'd fled the marriage, moved out of state, started over. But here she was, dead. Cause of death? Laura asked. Still working on it, the coroner replied. But I'll say this, there's water in her lungs. She was alive when she went under. Laura looked out over the lake. She didn't jump, she said softly. Someone put her there. Back at Jackson Ridge, the mood shifted instantly. Warden Robert Higgins was notified mid-morning. His reaction was unusual. He didn't break down, didn't ask questions. He simply nodded, muttered, "Thank you," and dismissed the officer with a cold wave of the hand. That afternoon, he sent an internal memo canceling all volunteer programs until further notice. Melissa's classroom was locked, her books boxed and removed. No memorial, no candlelight vigil, no word to the inmates she'd spent months teaching. She was erased as efficiently as a smudge on glass. But Laura wasn't done. She filed a warrant for access to Melissa's home computer and cell phone records. What she found raised more red flags than she'd expected. 3 days before her death, Melissa had searched for: can HIV be transmitted during oral sex? Prison affairs consequences. Divorce and inmate contact laws, Georgia. How to report abuse by correctional officers. The last search had been made at 11:47 p.m., just hours before she disappeared. Even more chilling, in her email drafts, Laura discovered an unsent message. To attorney.mcadams@protonmail.com. Subject, urgent. My husband knows everything. I'm afraid he's watching me. If anything happens, please find Derek Malone. He'll tell you the truth. Melissa never sent it, but someone had opened it. An hour later, the entire email account was deleted. Laura returned to the prison, this time with a homicide task force. Warden Higgins greeted them at the front gate, stone-faced. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Then prove it," Laura replied. "Let us in." He stepped aside, but behind his calm exterior, something had cracked. His eyes were darker. His hands fidgeted at his belt. For the first time since this began, Robert Higgins looked scared. In her interviews with staff, Laura pieced together a clearer timeline. On the night Melissa disappeared, she had called her sister at 7:12 p.m., saying she'd be home soon. A security guard remembered seeing her car leave the prison access road around 8 p.m. At 8:27 p.m., Robert's GPS tracker from his department-issued vehicle placed him just 4 miles from Lake Hartwell. When questioned, Robert claimed he'd gone for a drive to clear his head, but he had no receipts, no phone calls, no gas purchases, nothing to verify his route. And the most damning detail, the prison's main server, including internal camera backups, had been accessed remotely from Robert's home IP address at exactly 9:03 p.m. that night. "What were you deleting, Warden?" Laura whispered as she reviewed the logs. Laura returned to speak with Derek one final time. He looked better, stronger, but more guarded. "She's dead, isn't she?" he asked before she even sat down. "Yes, he killed her. We're working to prove that." Derek leaned back, eyes misting. "She was good, lost, but good. She didn't deserve to die for falling in love." Laura nodded. "What about you, Derek? Did you love her?" A long silence. Then, quietly, "I wanted to. I just never got the chance to try." The autopsy came back 2 days later. Cause of death: manual strangulation. Melissa had been choked until she lost consciousness, then dumped into the lake where she drowned. Defensive wounds on her arms confirmed she had struggled. It was murder, and only one man had the motive, the means, and the silence to pull it off. Robert Higgins was arrested outside the prison gates as he left work. He didn't resist, didn't speak, didn't even blink, just stared blankly at the press cameras as they clicked like gunfire. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the charges aloud. "Robert Eugene Higgins, you are hereby charged with first-degree murder, obstruction of justice, tampering with digital evidence, and abuse of power under state authority." Robert stood stiff in his navy blue prison-issued jumpsuit. Gone was the crisp uniform, the polished shoes, the stoic mask of authority. What stood in front of the judge now was a man stripped of his command, but not yet of his pride. He pleaded not guilty. His attorney, a well-known private defense lawyer from Atlanta, claimed Melissa's death was a tragic suicide manipulated by circumstantial evidence, and that Robert was a grieving husband being railroaded for political gain. But the prosecution, led by District Attorney Carla Vaughn, wasn't buying it, and neither was Detective Laura Monroe. Over the course of 2 months, Laura and the DA's office had built a case piece by piece. They started with digital evidence. The timestamp showing Robert accessed the internal prison security system on the night of Melissa's death from his home IP. The deletion of security footage logs from that week, recovered through forensic backup, and the chilling discovery that Melissa's email account had been logged into from a device registered to Robert just 1 hour after she drafted her final unsent email. Then came the GPS data. Robert claimed to be home all night, but his department-issued SUV placed him 4.2 miles from Lake Hartwell between 8:20 p.m. and 8:50 p.m., Just enough time to commit murder and disappear into the dark. And there was more. A prison guard, under immunity, testified that Robert had grown distant and volatile in the weeks after Melissa confessed her affair. He wasn't yelling, the guard said. He was quiet, too quiet, like a bomb you couldn't hear ticking. Another staffer, a nurse in the infirmary, admitted that Robert had personally requested copies of Derek Malone's medical records, something only the prison doctor or counselor was authorized to do. That's how he learned about Derek's HIV status. That's when he snapped. But perhaps the most damning testimony came from Melissa's younger sister, Hannah. On the stand, tears trembling on her lashes, she held up her phone. She called me the night she died, Hannah said. Told me she was leaving him. For good. Did she sound scared? The prosecutor asked. Yes, Hannah whispered. More than I'd ever heard her in my life. The prosecution entered a voicemail into evidence. One Melissa had left on Hannah's phone hours before her death. Hannah, it's me. I need you to know, if anything happens, I didn't give up. I'm trying. But Robert knows everything now. I think he might hurt me. I'm scared. Just don't let them forget who I was. The courtroom held its breath. Robert's defense team pushed back hard. They called expert witnesses who argued the GPS tracker could have malfunctioned. They claimed Melissa had a history of anxiety and depression. They implied Derek Malone, the manipulative inmate, had orchestrated it all. But nothing stuck, especially not after Derek himself took the stand. Derek entered the courtroom in handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit, thinner now, but still composed. He answered questions with slow, deliberate care. Did you have a relationship with Melissa Higgins? The prosecutor asked. Yes. Did she know you were HIV positive? Eventually. Did you ever threaten her? Never. Did she ever tell you she feared for her life? Derek paused. She said she thought Robert was watching her, that he'd changed, that he had a look in his eyes like she was already gone. Do you believe Robert Higgins killed her? Yes. I believe he wanted her gone more than he wanted her safe. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman's voice rang clear. We find the defendant, Robert Eugene Higgins, guilty on all counts. Gasps filled the courtroom. Robert didn't flinch, but his eyes, for the first time, dropped to the floor. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict sent shockwaves beyond the courthouse. Within days, the Georgia Department of Corrections launched an internal review of every mid to high-level administrator in the state. 4 wardens quietly resigned. 2 others were placed on leave pending investigation. Whistleblower hotlines lit up with anonymous tips, some credible, some desperate cries from the forgotten. Melissa's case had become more than a headline. It was a mirror held up to a broken system, exposing what happened when power went unchecked behind concrete walls and locked gates. Several legislators, pressured by advocacy groups and mounting public outrage, introduced new reform bills aimed at regulating staff conduct, improving transparency in prison surveillance systems, and offering stronger legal protections for civilian volunteers. One lawmaker even quoted Melissa during a session. She believed people deserved to be seen. We failed to see her. This bill is one way we say, never again. The prison system would never be the same, and neither would the people who walked its halls, inmate or staff. From warden to inmate, from king of the castle to just another number. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Detective Laura Monroe stood outside the courthouse after the verdict, reporters swarming her for comment. She said only this: justice wasn't easy to get here, but Melissa's voice didn't die in that lake. We heard it. Back at Jackson Ridge, the guards whispered about it for months. Some said Robert cried his first night in solitary. Others claimed he asked to be kept in a different facility, far from where he used to rule. But the real tragedy lingered in the empty classroom near the library. Melissa's books were never returned. Her nameplate still sat in a drawer. And on the wall, behind a loose panel of drywall later discovered during renovation, someone had scratched a quote into the concrete. "To be seen is to be remembered." It wasn't signed, but Laura knew who had written it. The trial of Robert Higgins opened on a gray Monday morning inside the Franklin County Courthouse, just 2 blocks from where Melissa had once hosted poetry readings for at-risk teens. Now, the woman who had once tried to heal others became the center of a case that revealed just how deeply power could rot from within. Courtroom 3B was packed. Media vans lined the street. Victim advocacy groups held candles outside the courthouse doors. And inside, every eye was trained on the man in the defendant's chair. The former warden who had once towered over an entire prison now sat still and silent in an orange jumpsuit. This was not just a murder trial. This was a reckoning. District Attorney Carla Vaughn stood tall as she opened the case. Melissa Higgins was more than a wife. More than a volunteer. She was a woman trying to reclaim her identity, one who paid with her life for daring to step outside the prison her husband built around her. Robert Higgins didn't just kill her with his hands. He killed her with surveillance, with fear, with the belief that, as long as he wore a badge, he could get away with anything. She pointed to the jury. But today, we remind him, and everyone watching, that no one is above the law. The defense fired back, painting Melissa as a woman spiraling after shame, claiming she had taken her own life in an act of guilt and desperation. "There is no proof beyond a reasonable doubt," said lead defense attorney Mark Candler, "that Mr. Higgins committed this crime. No fingerprints, no witnesses, just assumptions and bias." But the prosecution had built a wall, not with one brick, but many. The deleted email, the GPS logs, the access to prison security footage, the pattern of emotional control, the autopsy confirming strangulation. And then there were the people, the ones Melissa had trusted with slivers of her truth. Hannah Willis, Melissa's sister, wept on the stand. She told me she was afraid of him, that she wasn't herself anymore, that every time she tried to leave, he reminded her who he was and what he could do. Hannah shared text messages from Melissa, screenshots with timestamps that backed up her story. Messages Melissa had once deleted, but Hannah had saved just in case. Detective Laura Monroe testified next. Calm, precise, unshaken, she walked the jury through the timeline. Every data point, every contradiction, every click Robert had made the night Melissa died. "The camera logs don't lie," she said. "The system was accessed remotely. The footage erased. Only one person had the authority and the knowledge to do that." When the defense tried to poke holes in the tech evidence, Laura countered with digital forensic reports, hard proof that couldn't be argued away. Her closing words hit hard. "Power doesn't make you innocent. It only makes it easier to hide." But the most emotional moment came when Derek Malone took the stand again. Now more gaunt than ever, shackled and guarded, he faced the jury with eyes filled with pain. He didn't beg for sympathy. He didn't defend the affair. "What I did with Melissa was wrong," he admitted. "But I never forced her. I never lied about who I was." He paused. She knew what I was, but she saw more than that. She saw me. He then recounted the last time he saw her, pale, shaking, terrified. She said Robert hadn't touched her in years, that he didn't raise his voice, just made her feel like she didn't exist. That's worse sometimes. When she told him about us and the diagnosis, I knew he wouldn't forgive her, but I never thought he'd kill her. His voice cracked. I loved her. That's the truth. And now she's dead because she stopped being afraid, and he couldn't handle that. The prosecution rested. The courtroom held its breath. The defense scrambled to recover, called psychologists, experts on trauma, former colleagues of Roberts who spoke of his professionalism. But none of it could erase the mountain of evidence, nor the growing realization that this wasn't just a crime of passion. It was a calculated execution, a statement from a man who believed he could control even death. Closing arguments were delivered on a Thursday afternoon. D.A. Vaughn stood before the jury, her voice low and steady. Melissa's last message wasn't a scream, it was a whisper, a plea. She wanted someone to hear her, finally. And now, she needs someone to speak for her. She looked Robert in the eyes. You silenced her once. You will not silence her again. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman read the verdict. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. Gasps echoed. Robert closed his eyes. On the charge of obstruction of justice, guilty. On the charge of evidence, tampering, guilty. On all remaining counts, guilty. At sentencing, the judge delivered his final statement. Robert Higgins used his position not to protect, but to destroy. In betraying the trust of both his wife and this state, he committed the ultimate violation of justice. I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Robert said nothing. He was led away in chains. A warden no more. Now just another inmate behind the very walls he once ruled. Outside, Detective Monroe stood beneath the courthouse steps, her badge clipped to her belt, her face unreadable. A reporter asked her, "What made this case different?" She paused. "She did," Laura replied. Melissa fought back in the only way she could. With emails. With whispers. With courage. She didn't die invisible. We saw her. The prison didn't feel the same anymore. Jackson Ridge, once run like a fortress of order under Robert Higgins, had become a place haunted by whispers and regret. His fall had sent a ripple through the entire correctional system, not just because of what he did, but because of how long it had gone unnoticed. The guard walked quieter now. The inmates talked louder. And in the corner of the prison library, where Melissa's reading classes used to take place, a single chair remained unoccupied. They never replaced her. Derek Malone was transferred to another facility upstate. For his own safety, his sentence remained the same, 18 years. But after his cooperation in the investigation, he was moved into protective custody and offered therapy for trauma and survivor's guilt. In his final interview with Detective Monroe before transfer, he sat with his head low, hands folded, voice soft. "She didn't deserve me," he said. "She deserves someone who could have taken her out of that place, not dragged her deeper into it." Laura didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. In a small church outside of Savannah, Melissa's memorial service took place 1 month after the trial ended. Her sister Hannah organized it. Quiet, simple, exactly how Melissa would have wanted. The program included a poem Melissa had once written in college. "I stood behind walls I didn't build. Learned to whisper in rooms that echoed. But even silence has weight. And one day, I will speak again." Hannah read it aloud with trembling hands. People wept, not just for Melissa, but for every woman who had stayed silent too long. Detective Laura Monroe returned to work 2 weeks later, her inbox flooded with other cases. But she couldn't shake this one, not because of the press, not because of the politics, but because Melissa had almost slipped through the cracks, and because no one had noticed until it was too late. Laura took on a new assignment shortly after, a statewide task force on abuse of power within correctional facilities. She made sure Melissa's name was the first one written in the program's opening report, the Melissa Higgins Reform Initiative. As for Robert Higgins, he was assigned to Red Hollow State Prison, far from his former domain. There he lived in near isolation, not for his safety, but because no one wanted to speak to him. Not the inmates, not the guards. They called him the Warden, but not with respect. With venom, Robert rarely spoke. Not to guards, not to counselors, and certainly not to the other inmates. He kept a rigid schedule, waking at 5 a.m., folding his blanket with military precision, staring at the cell wall for hours like it owed him answers. Once a week, he was allowed a book. He never finished any of them. He just flipped pages, his eyes barely moving, as if he were searching for a word he had forgotten. There were no visitors, no letters, no calls. One guard reported hearing Robert whisper late at night to no one. Sometimes just a name, Melissa. Other times, you shouldn't have lied. Another said he found torn-up photographs stuffed into the toilet. Old printouts of Melissa smiling beside stacks of books. The man who once controlled everything now controlled nothing. And that, perhaps, was the only sentence he truly understood. There were rumors that he stopped eating for days, that he ripped photos of Melissa off the wall in his cell, that, once a month, he whispered to her in the dark. No one visited him, not even Hannah. 1 year later, Melissa's classroom at Jackson Ridge was quietly reopened, not for lessons, but as a reading nook for inmates struggling with literacy. A small plaque was mounted on the wall, in memory of Melissa Higgins, who believed everyone deserved to be seen. Inmates began leaving notes there, poems, letters, reflections. Some were confessions, some were thanks. One note, and signed, said, "I never knew her, but I wish I had. She made the walls feel less like prison." The final chapter belonged to a child, not Melissa's, but the daughter of one of the inmates she had tutored. The girl had written Melissa a letter just a month before her death, thanking her for teaching her father how to read so he could help me with my homework. Hannah found the letter unopened in Melissa's purse. She framed it and kept it on her nightstand. To Miss Melissa, Daddy says you're kind. Thank you for making him better. I hope you smile a lot. Love, Kayla, age 8. In the end, Melissa wasn't just a victim. She was a mirror, one that reflected everything broken in the system. Power unchecked, silence enforced, love twisted by control. But through her story, others were heard. And that was justice in its most fragile form. Sometimes, late at night, Laura Monroe returns to her case files. She doesn't reread the reports or watch the interviews. She opens Melissa's final email draft, the one that never sent. "I think he might hurt me. Just don't let them forget who I was." And Laura whispers to the screen, "We won't. If this story moved you, if Melissa's voice deserved to be heard, then help us keep stories like hers alive." Please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who cares, and subscribe to the channel for more true stories that deserve to be remembered. Every click helps make sure these voices are never forgotten.